So most UN agencies use this definition from OECD, where impact means both positive and negative, primary and secondary, long-term effects. Now, whether these are caused directly or indirectly, intended or unintended by a development intervention. The World Bank has a more quantitative sort of formulaic definition where you have an indicator of interest and you measure it over time. So if the current time period is year 0 and the next time period is year 1, the difference in the indicator over year 1 and year 0 is the impact that has occurred. The impact management project, which we will speak about a little bit in a couple of minutes on what it is has expanded the definition to include not just an impact for human beings, but also impact on the planet. So it is
Let me jump in here because we're not seeing the slides at the moment.
Sorry.
I believe.
I will share my screen again.
Yes. No.
Thank you for that, Pedro. Okay. So here are the definitions. And so I was talking about the impact management project broadening its definition for impact to not just cover social impact, but also environmental outcomes and both positive and negative outcomes. So the idea is that when we think about impact, we usually think about an objective that we've set out that is positive and intentional, and over time seeing if that objective has been met. But every action, this is basic high school physics, every action has a reaction, and everything that we do in our business activities is having impacts, whether we like them or not, whether we measure them or not, whether we manage them or not. We are causing impacts through our business, and they could be both positive and negative. They could be both direct or indirect, and they could be intended or unintended. So what is worthwhile to measure? We will also look at that in a few minutes. But what is the difference between impact measurement versus impact management? Impact measurement is the first act of quantifying your effects. So whether the changes that are happening directly or indirectly, the act of trying to calculate these changes, to measure these changes, is the first step. And basically, in layman terms, it's tracking your progress against stated goals. Impact management goes one step further. It is once you have the data, once you have quantified, how do you use that on an ongoing basis to improve your business practices, to maximize the positive and mitigate the harm? Do you incorporate it as a learning practice in your business model? Do you use data and evidence to improve and use it as a feedback mechanism? So once that starts happening, the practice becomes from one time to an ongoing management practice that becomes integrated as part of how you do business. So I'll take a step back into why this is important today and why we are seeing such a huge surge in demand for impact management and why it has become the field it is today. Essentially, in what was recognized was a growth in impact investment in the last 5 to 10 years has resulted in this movement, mostly from investors that are demanding a more standardized way to be able to compare whether one investment in Thailand is more impactful versus another investment in Brazil. And how do I know the capital that I'm allocating is creating the change that I wanted to do? So there is, while there's a growth in funding and allocation of resources towards impact investing, there isn't a common standardized framework to measure or compare. We have this in traditional investing, we have this common standards for principle and standards and principles for accounting that we take for granted. But it wasn't the case 100 years ago when the Great Depression happened and there was a lot of economic growth in the wake of the Great Depression in the 1930s. There wasn't a common structure for accounting that was global. Today when someone uses the words return on investment or a balance sheet or a net profit, anywhere across the world, the words mean the same, the calculation is the same, the world is aligned on how it is done. But there isn't one for impact investing, at least there wasn't one up until a few years ago when the Impact Management Project brought together a community of 2,000 investors as well as enterprises to build this consensus so that we all talk about the same things when we're talking about positive impacts and ESG risks. So in this effort of trying to bring together people on the same page on how we describe our impact, we have today what we call the norms of impact management, or a common logic that can help investors and enterprises understand the impacts that they're having. This common logic is also part of BCTA's Impact Lab that we will share with you in a moment. The idea is that as the field is evolving, as the concepts are coming to fruition with standardized frameworks, we are seeing a proliferation of tools that can help both investors and companies align themselves. Today, the Impact Management Project operates as a structured network, which the UNDP is a part of, and we're a signatory of. And the idea is to work together as a network to provide complete standards for measurement and reporting. So there is a lot to discuss and learn about these global norms. And I encourage you to use the Impact Management Project's website to explore the resources. There are multiple layers to it. If you do follow the steps in the Impact Lab, then you are using that framework. But if you are eager to learn more, I think we can just put in the chat thank you, Pedro, on the more resources on learning about the Impact Management Project. So while this is an investor-driven field, what does it look like for companies? There's a lot of conversation about the SDGs, but not surprisingly, reporting on SDGs, especially quantitative reporting on SDGs, is not very common. This was a study done by PwC in 2019, where they found, and it was, I think, a sample of 1,400 largest companies in the world, where they found that 72% of the companies were mentioning the SDGs in their annual reports, just mentioning the SDGs. 25% of them were incorporating them in their strategy. That means their strategy said that there was something to do with sustainable development. Are those 14% of them had specific targets that were linked to the SDGs? But a mere 1% were reporting quantitative progress on these targets. So you can see while there's a lot of uptake on and a belief that the SDGs are a common unifying framework for the private sector, actually measuring the progress and reporting on it is quite rare. And that's where we feel that companies can really explore this niche and position themselves as leaders and pioneers. So if you are someone who is measuring your impact aligned with the SDGs, it is something that is not a common practice, but will be going on in future. So something that you can prioritize today to benefit from going forward. It is also, of course, as I mentioned, a demand from the investors. But as inclusive businesses, I think one of the main concerns that we hear from companies is that, am I actually making a progress or contributing in the way that I think I am? I have these intended goals for my company, what I want to reach in 1 year or 2 years, what you have in your inclusive business commitments. How do you know if the contribution is really happening? And that's where we feel that's the most the biggest benefit for impact measurement lies there in understanding for yourself how you're doing. We did a survey towards the end of last year where we heard from companies on why it was important for them. And just to reflect back on the right-hand side on the diagram, the few of the most popular answers were to understand my business's impact value chain, to quantify impact, which was a few of you also wrote on Menti, to be able to communicate with my stakeholders, not just my investors, but also my clients, to be able to build brand reputation, to be able to understand my customers, to be able to understand my market, to drive my operations. So you can see that a lot of, and these are companies that have done impact measurement with BCtA. These are those that have, over the last 5 years, worked with us to understand their impact. And to them, you would see that a lot of these benefits are commercial, that they're able to use impact measurement and management to drive their business forward, not just to understand the social impact, but also to drive it in terms of business value. So I have one more poll, and I wanted to know how you feel about impact measurement in terms of your company. Do companies need to be a certain size, large or small, to do impact measurement? Do companies need to be a certain readiness in terms of maturity, commercial performance, or can anyone get started on impact measurement? Given your experience in your company, what do you think is true? Thank you. Here are the results. Most of you agree with us. We feel that anybody, regardless of size and a level of readiness, can get, at the very least, can get started on impact measurement and management. There are some things that require more resources. For example, a lot more quantitative, rigorous data collection requires a certain level of resources, or sometimes in a moment of crisis, like at the start of the pandemic, where everybody was grappling with new realities, it may not be the right time to do it. However, there are some things within impact measurement that everybody can do and get started on. And those are the things that we will focus on for the remainder of this workshop. How do we all get started on impact measurement? What is some things that everybody can do and start at least embarking on this journey? And that is going to be the focus for the next section of this workshop. I'm going to hand over to, no, this is not a handover yet. I will talk a little bit about the process of impact measurement. So we did talk about the why, but we now get into the how. So having looked at various frameworks and tools that are available today, we find that there's a common process that everybody can undertake. And at least the first 3 steps of these is something that you can do just getting started today. You do not need to invest a ton of resources or time. There are clear steps that you can take that we have laid out. The first one being that you can start mapping how your business activities today contribute to your long-term and short-term goals and targets. The second step is to then frame them with indicators, so how to identify key performance indicators that can help you track progress on the outputs and outcomes you've defined. So this can be in the form of standardized indicators from global databases, or you can use customized bespoke indicators that are specific to your business model. And the third one is to start aligning that with the standards and practices that are set forth by the impact management projects guidelines. So at least these three things you are able to do without committing a lot of resources. Then in the fourth step, you start looking at what is the existing data that you already have within your business. It could be that you are sitting on a lot of operational data or administrative data that is already saying something about your outputs and outcomes. And then start reviewing what additional evidence needs to be gathered. What is the missing picture here to understand your impact better? And then to review what are the different approaches to collecting that data. Once this data starts coming in, the idea is to go back to your plan. And this is why this process is in a cyclical diagram. The idea is that it is not done once, that it is done repeatedly, that once you have collected some data, you go back to the drawing board, look at your theory of change or the impact value chain again, and to see whether your business operations need to be adjusted, or your goals need to be redefined, or if something is working, how to scale that up. If something is not working, how to tweak it. So what we say is that this is a living document that you go back to periodically, whether it's every quarter or twice a year, and so on. So that's what we refer to as the process of impact measurement and management. And these are the same steps that we have in the Business Call to Action Impact Lab. If you haven't yet had a chance to use BCTA's tool, in a short while, we will be giving you a small demo of how it works as well. But essentially, these are the steps that you can take in the Impact Lab to get started on your IMM framework. The first step is to start thinking about your stakeholders. Now, stakeholders are people, or it could be the planet, that is being affected by your business activities. So I'd like to maybe see if you have a piece of paper next to you, or you can use the chat box to think about who your stakeholders are and what you think changes for them.
Now that Ravel built mostly the case for why doing impact management and measurement and some of the benefits of it, now we will be jumping to the more practical part, more the technical part of how you start by doing it. And the first step, and the one that we'll be covering today, as you've seen by the impact management and measurement cycle that Ravel has showed you before, will be planning for impact. Now, the first and foremost thing when you plan for impact will be to set your impact goals. Now, these impact goals probably won't differ that much from some of the goals that you might already have as an organization. Maybe you even define already what we mean by impact goals just without realizing or framing it as impact goals. But here are three things that we have to keep in mind that guarantee that you are coming up with an impact goal. So not only an operational goal as your organization, but a goal that is meant to have an impact lens. So first, it should have an important, positive, long-term outcome for your stakeholders. So this should generate a long-lasting, sustainable, positive impact on the livelihoods of the stakeholders that you are addressing. Regardless if it's your suppliers, your customers, your staff. Now, the second topic here, the second issue that your impact goal should cover is that it should be measurable against a recognized benchmark. And why? Because you want to also keep track of your progress towards this goal. You also want to try to compare it possibly with other actors that are on the field. And to do so, you need to have sort of a benchmark that measures how your goal is being achieved or not. And third, and something that will be covered a bit more extensively today, the goals should be mapped to the Sustainable Development Goals, and not only to the goals itself, but the targets that are within each Sustainable Development Goal, within each SDG. We'll look now just briefly later on why you should map specifically not only to the goals but to the targets as well. One thing to keep in mind when you are also drafting your goals is that they should be mission aligned. So tendentially, according to academic literature, a mission statement should have 8 words. So those 8 words should at least include a verb, a target population, and an outcome that is measurable. Now, these 8 words would be concise and enough to describe the mission that you have. So this, just by having a verb, the target population that you're affecting, and the outcome that is measurable, you should be able to have a good mission statement. So examples of good mission statements that are concise and immediately transmit to us the idea and even the impact that it generates. We have rehabilitate coral reefs in the Western Pacific and prevent maternal child transmission of HIV in Africa. Now, you want to set mission-aligned goals to avoid mission drift. So you want to make sure that these goals are aligned so that you are covering, or that you are making sure that your impact and also your organization is going alongside the mission that it sets itself to. This also would allow you to focusing on the what you're trying to achieve, and not so much of how you get there. That comes after you defining your goals. Make sure you include concrete results that you want to achieve as a goal. So not only keeping it very, you should keep it. Of course, it is a long-lasting change, but you should have sort of a goal that concrete results that you strive for. Then this will also help you tackling the problem your mission describes, and this is really important to also involve all of your stakeholders when drafting your goal. And a bit more on this point just now. Why should you try to also involve your stakeholders when drafting your goal? Because then you will make sure that these goals are significant and relevant to your stakeholders. Sometimes as an organization, and we see that a lot, we tend to be, of course, sitting on our offices and sometimes be a bit distant from the end customers that we have, or the end stakeholders that we are trying to impact their livelihoods. The idea is, whenever possible, try to co-create your goals with the stakeholders by asking them questions, by understanding if this goal is actually what fits their needs, if this goal is what generates the impact that you want to cause in their lives. Because it happens often that we can predetermine and think that a goal will necessarily match their needs and generate a positive impact into their livelihoods, but it might not always be necessarily the case. So whenever possible, also try to bring in the stakeholders into the co-creation of your goals. And now, when I'm talking about stakeholders, it can be your clients, but it can even be types of donors or other types of funders that you might have to your organization, your employees, or even the government. Plenty of stakeholders that you can think of when you're measuring impact. And a bit related as well with what Rafael was just discussing before. How do you know? How do you decide which stakeholders are you going to include? She already covered a bit that point, but then once you've decided on which stakeholders are you going to involve, then how many of them should you consider? Here we have 2 small pieces of advice. So one is you should consider differences and involve your sample accordingly, the differences. So for example, if your goal is mostly focused on women empowerment, let's say, then it will make sense that the sample mostly comprises of women and not most of men, right? But then these are small things that you should also consider. Even also, for example, if you are working on an education project that you are addressing the impact on childhood education, and you want to look at the 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, then most of the age classes that your sample should rely on should be these age classes that you're assessing. And then the second advice here is to keep asking until you stop hearing different things. What do we mean here? Involve stakeholders up until the point that the story that you hear is always the same, because that will mean that you've reached your saturation point. By this time, when you hear always the same story, you probably already reached the point where your sample is diverse enough and that you won't hear any more different aspects that could be relevant to yours. So keep the numbers of stakeholders up until the point that the story repeats itself over and over. Now, Probably most of you are familiar with the SDGs, but just a quick recap on the SDGs that were created now almost 6 years ago. The idea is that there's these 17 SDGs, and of course they all sometimes they can be quite broad, right? They are in the end assessing, trying to fit in 17 layers, so to say, all possible changes that can happen either for people in this world or even the planet. So sometimes the SDGs just fitting all these changes in development that can happen. It might be difficult to be very concrete just by looking at one broad SDG. So that's why it's important to not only look at the SDGs when you're mapping your impact, but also looking at the targets that are within each SDG. So for example, just picking the example of the first SDG, SDG 1, no poverty. Just in the same SDG, we have different targets. One, if you look at 1.1, we're talking about eradicating extreme poverty. But now when we move to 1.4, now we already have ensuring equal access to economic resources as basic services. So there are already two very different things. Of course, both these targets relate to solving poverty in the world, but they do it through different ways. This is why it's important for you to also look at the targets, because maybe some of you might be working towards eradicating extreme poverty, but others might be working towards providing access to these basic services. So both of you would be mapping your impact towards the SDG 1, but you probably be mapping towards different targets and therefore towards different dimensions within SDG 1. Looking now of a more concrete example of why it is important to look at the targets, I have here a quick exercise that I wanted to count with your participation. So let's say that this is an organization that BCtA works with, and their goal is to ensure that migrant factory workers have access to dignified and affordable housing. Now, should this organization map their goal towards SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, that says make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable? Or should this organization be mapping their goal towards SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, that says promote, sustain, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all? Now, I wanted to give you 1 minute, and you can post your either if it's SDG 11 or 8 in the chat, and just to give a sense of an idea of where would you be mapping this goal. So you can write in the chat if it's either 11 for you or SDG 8. And don't be shy, feel free to try your attempt. So we have Hassan saying that it should be mapped towards SDG 11. We have a different opinion from Anne, SDG 8. Philly also says 8. Siad says both, depending on how it's contextualized. Both. And thanks for your opinion so far. Both again. Anyone that has a very strong particular for one of the, actually either both. Okay, thank you for your participation. So I've seen that most of you, it's very actually, we have a big diverse range of choices. We had a lot of people going for both, and then sort of half on 8 on 11. Now, would this help if we have, sorry, my Zoom bar is just over this target. Now, if I would add the target 11.1 that says by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. So now we have this affordable housing that it's mentioned concretely on SDG 11. So for those of you that said, this is also, again, this is not a direct concrete science. It doesn't mean that if you would map towards SDG 8, again, there's also a part that we're talking about migrant factory workers. So there's also, you could see it also as mapped to the SDG 8. And this is not to say that that if you had mapped towards SDG 8, that's makes completely no sense. But the idea here is to show you that when you, it might be difficult to pinpoint which exactly SDG, and more likely we could see a way of mapping to both SDGs, as most of you mentioned. But now when we dive a bit deeper into the targets, we see that there's one that directly mentions affordable housing. So most likely we would be mapping towards SDG 11 and then choosing target 11.1. But it was also mentioned in the chat, sometimes it might be a bit how it is contextualized. This is not to say that, again, that this is the right SDG and that other one is the wrong SDG, but it's just to give you an example that it will be much helpful for you when you look then into the targets and look into the targets and find the target that might better match the goal that you are looking for. Now, it also happens, of course, frequently, of course, there are 17 SDGs and more than 100 targets. It doesn't also mean that you will always find a target that exactly is it identified or really tells completely the story of your business model. If that's not the case, try to find a proxy or the target that matches the most your impact. So now that we looked at goals and some of the goals that we've seen here, a lot of you were mentioning we will achieve this goal by doing this or through this. So that is pretty much what we'll be looking at now, which is, so what happens? How do you map what happens for you to achieve your goal? And that's also a building block and a really important part of how you measure your impact, is to look at how you reach your goal and how you're going to map the impact that happens through these steps for you to reach that goal. And that will be done by creating an impact value chain. So we'll just go, before we step into what an impact value chain is, it's important to understand what is the center pillar for this impact value chain, and that is theory of change. Now, probably most of you have heard about theory of change before. Maybe some of you even built your business model based on theory of change. So a quick recap here for some of you, and for those of you, an introduction to this concept. The idea of theory of change is that you start by defining a goal, and then you do backwards planning. So as you've seen, we just did that part. We started by the very end. So we looked at the goal that you achieve as an organization. And now you'll be starting looking at all the steps that happen to you as an organization for you to achieve that goal. So for you to actually mapping this goal or trying to have this goal is because you as an organization identified a problem that is out there that you want to solve. Then once you've identified that problem, you as an organization carry certain activities to solve that same problem. Then you will specify the assumptions that allow you to say that, okay, these activities result in output. So because you as an organization did X or Y to solve the problem that you have identified, the result of those activities is the output. Once you map these immediate results, the outputs, then you will look at what will happen in the short, medium term. What will be these short, medium term effects of the results that you've just came across? And that will be the outcomes. And then once you've mapped the outcomes, then you will also specify the assumptions that allow you to get to the goal, the long-term impact that you are creating. I know I'm going through this a bit quickly, but that is because now we will be jumping to the impact value chain, which, as you've seen, it's pretty much just as theory of change, is based on theory of change, but with some small tweaks here that I'll be covering now. So now we not only talk about problems, because you also might start your business by looking at an opportunity that was out there in the market that you wanted to address. And these problems and opportunities will be mostly social or environmental constraints. So you are either solving problems or opportunities that are focusing on people or the planet and people's livelihoods or the planet. Then once you've identified these problems or opportunities, you put your inputs or carry activities, which again are what your organization or your business does to solve the problems or leverage on the opportunities that have just been identified. Notice that here in impact value chain, you don't have to specify the assumptions as you had to do back on theory of change. Then once you've conducted these activities as a business, these inputs that you provide or the activities that you run as an organization, then you will incur into immediate results. So these are the immediate results that happen just after your inputs that you provide. So to give you a very concrete example here, imagine that I work in the agribusiness sector, and I've identified that a problem is that the farmers that I worked with in some rural communities, they have lack of skills or lack of proper equipment tools to provide to create. Georgie, I believe you are unmuted. Thank you. Hi, Jody, by the way. Nice to see you here. And then, so going back to the problem that we've identified, farmers that lack training or proper equipment tools, you as an organization would provide these tools. That will be your input as an activity. The output, the immediate result of this is that farmers become equipped with these tools. Or if you were, for example, providing training, the immediate output, the immediate result is that farmers become trained. I know this might seem obvious, but it's really important to map exactly this immediate result that happens, because it might be that, for example, and especially we'll look at this in the second session of this workshop, when we're looking at indicators and when you're collecting data, you want to have a part that measures the inputs, the trainings that you run, but you also want to have a part that will measure how many farmers actually became trained. So even though if this looks very logic and very obvious, and sometimes we would probably think, okay, if I train farmers, then there's no point in putting in my impact value chain that farmers become trained. Make sure you include these obvious steps, because you need to map everything that happens up until you reach your impact goals. So you would have an input that is training farmers, and then you would have the output, the immediate result, what happens just after on this smaller time frame would be that these farmers become trained. Now the outcomes would be the short and medium term effects that derive from these outputs. So again, picking up this example of the farmers being trained, now the outcome might be that because farmers are trained, they produce higher yields, or that they increase their agricultural productivity. So as you see, this is already a bit different than the short immediate result, which is farmers are trained. And for you to measure the outcomes, this would be something that happens as a consequence. So they become trained, and then over time, you'll see that they'll have higher yields or they increase their agricultural productivity. And then the impact goals is what will happen then on a long run, regardless if it's positive or negative. Also keep into account that it's important to map if your impact is positive, but it's also important to look at impact that might be negative. And then this would be what's generated in the long term. So again, picking up this example that I just mentioned, if the outcome was that these farmers are providing higher yields or increasing the agricultural productivity, then the impact goal that might derive for this is that they have improved livelihoods, that you have increased the incomes. Why? Because now they have better agricultural productivity, so they manage to produce more or in better quality, and they manage to increase their incomes by the bigger increase in the quantity that they sell, for example. So notice how this becomes, the timeline also becomes bigger and bigger. So when you have outputs would be something that happens immediately, outcomes, something that is more in short and medium term effect, and impact goals, something that happens on a very long run. There are no specific thresholds that we can give you in terms of time. Let's say that there's not an official threshold that say output is something that happens in 1 week, and then outcomes would be something that happens in 3-6 months, and impact goals in 5 years. There are not concrete benchmarks for this, but try to understand always what happens specifically towards your business model, what happens immediately, what happens in the short, medium term run, and what happens in the very long run. Also keep in mind here that as you move in impact value chain, so as you move over time, it will be more challenging to attribute concretely what is the impact that you can map to your organization. So it will be, of course, easier to measure the impact on the output part. So it would be easier to know how many farmers became trained. It's a bit more difficult to know how many farmers, because of your training, are now producing higher yields. Because there are other external factors, as you know, that will come into play. And it will be even a bit more challenging to say how many of these, which farmers of this have improved livelihoods because of you, because then, especially on the long run, even more factors will come into play. This is not to say that you cannot attribute the impact on the outcome scale, on the impact goal scale, but it's just to give you here the idea that, of course, the locus of control that you have as an organization will become smaller and smaller while you move across the impact value chain. Now, I gave you an example on the agriculture sector, and now to also make this concept a bit more graspable, I'll just quickly go through 3 examples. The first one that we're looking at the healthcare sector. We're looking at as an input, this organization provides device distribution and training to doctors. The output, see here, what happens immediately is that these doctors become trained and empowered to use the device of the company. The outcome that happens on a short-term, medium-term effect will be that these doctors become have better skills to identify the complications and high-risk pregnancies. And the long run will be that these doctors are able to save much more lives. Now, moving to the second example, an organization that provides as an input training for farmers on animal health and feeding. The output is that there's an increased quantity and quality of milk that these farmers produce now. The outcome, the short-term, medium-term effect is that these farmers have higher incomes and more assets. And the long-term goal that this results is that there will be greater efficiency and productivity in the dairy sector. And now looking for going to another example more related in the ICT sector. We have an organization that offers affordable internet data bundles. This results in immediate cost savings on connectivity services. Because of this, as an outcome, the communities that they work in use more these connectivity services, and that will contribute to the long-term goal that they bridge these digital divides, that they manage to bring more people into the digital world.